Good afternoon and welcome to the latest briefing in the New York Foreign Press Center's 2022 US midterm election series focused on voting rights. I would like to welcome our FPC members as well as our overseas journalists. My name is Mavish Siddiqui and I'm the moderator. First, I will go over the ground rules, and after that, I will introduce our speaker. Following our speaker's opening remarks, I will open the floor for questions. Now for the ground rules. The briefing is on the record. A briefer is an independent expert, and the views expressed by the briefer are her own. A briefer is not affiliated with the Department of State or the US government and does not reflect the views of the Department of State or US government. Participation in Foreign Press Center programming does not imply endorsement, approval, or recommendation of briefers' views. For today's briefing, we welcome Dr. Lisa Bryant. Dr. Bryant is the current chair of the Department of Political Science at California State University, Fresno. She has worked with several nonpartisan organizations to better understand voter behavior and increase voter registration and turnout. Her work has been published in several journals, including American Politics Research, Political Behavior, Electoral Studies, and Publius, the Journal of Federalism. Dr. Bryant currently serves on the National Research Advisory Board for the Electronic Registration Information Center. In today's briefing, Dr. Bryant will explore voting rights and the ways in which people will cast their ballots in the 2022 midterms. And with that, it is my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Bryant. Over to you, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you for all the interest in this topic. It's something I feel very passionate about. So I am going to start today. I know it's very interesting speaking to the foreign press because often I'm speaking to American press and there's sort of assumptions built in about what people know about our election system. So I'm just going to start with a short background about sort of the current state of our election system and the electoral landscape in the United States. So I hope this is not too repetitive for people, but I think it's a good starting point. So an important thing, I think that it's true worldwide, right? That election landscapes, no two elections are the same. That the context surrounding the election, the candidates, the current events going on happen all the time. One thing is maybe a little bit more unique about the American election landscape is that our policies and processes are also constantly evolving. So there are hundreds of state level changes in policy about election code between every election cycle. The United States also has an extraordinarily high number of elections that go on. So we're going into the federal midterm elections, and some states like California do a model of what is called consolidated elections, where we put all of our state and local and federal elections on the same ballot to try and reduce the number of elections that run at any time. But many states don't do that. So for example, Louisiana will vote in the federal midterm election in November, and then they have a state election in December, not even a month later. And so voters can experience different processes and different rules in different elections, even in the same state, even in the same jurisdiction. So our very decentralized system of elections, where the states have control over how elections are run, not the federal government, and then to some degree, even local jurisdictions can choose to run different voting models, makes it very messy and very confusing. So, for example, like here in California, we have counties have the option to adopt what is called the Voter Choice Act, which makes voting very accessible to people. It sends everybody a vote by mail ballot. We have vote centers that are open for 11 days, right? Some counties can opt out of that. They don't have to adopt it. It's not mandated by the state. So a neighboring county could have voting only on election day in person, and your family or friends across the county line have 11 days to be able to go vote. So those very different processes make for very different election experiences and make for a very messy and confusing system. It's widely accepted in the United States now that election day is a misnomer. We don't think about elections as being election day anymore. There's still that buildup and excitement thinking about election day. And going and getting your I voted sticker, which is very popular in the US, right? But really, most places run elections as an election week, and for some places, even election months. So 16 states in the United States right now are already casting ballots for the November election. People are casting those ballots by mail, and soon in some of those places, early in-person voting will take place. But there's already been over 500,000 ballots cast for the upcoming November election, even though we're still a month out, right? And that makes our election process and election administration interesting and exciting, and opens the door for lots of challenges to election code because voters all experience a very different type of election experience, right? In terms of like federal oversight for US elections, and I think because some of you are probably from places where their elections are run federally and there are more consistent rules and more consistent code across all jurisdictions across the country, we have very little federal oversight over elections. We have a federal elections commission, but they primarily really only look at campaign finance. They don't really look at election code or the process of how elections are run. And then we have an election assistance commission. And the election assistance commission was created primarily to distribute federal funds that will help jurisdictions update their equipment, provide some guidance on what are good policy best practices, but they really don't have any enforcement mechanisms. They don't have any way to make jurisdictions adopt best practices or to adopt certain policies. The one area where they have gained some traction is in the voting equipment that we use. So there are federally certified vendors that the federal government has tested the voting equipment, made sure that that voting equipment is secure. And so states have to use equipment that meets federal requirements. States can then have their own stricter requirements, and they can put vendors on the list. They can reduce the number of vendors on the list that meet state requirements, but they have to at least meet the federal requirements. Otherwise, they won't qualify for any federal assistance in their equipment and the certification of that equipment. And so that is one place where the Election Assistance Commission has gained some traction in enforcement. Most of the changes, the American election landscape has really changed a lot since 2000. So most of you probably know the 2000 election with George W. Bush was very contentious in the United States, and many people believe that it was decided by the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court ordered the state of Florida to stop counting the ballots and that whoever was the victor at that time would become the president. That really, for the first time in US history, put a lot of focus on how elections are run in the country. Prior to 2000, Americans pretty much believed that our elections were fair, let me back up. Civil rights and voting rights aside, right, talking about the actual process of counting the ballots, people pretty much believed that our elections were run pretty well, that there was no reason to lack confidence that your votes were being counted correctly, but the spectacle of seeing the counts and the recounts with the hanging chads and the butterfly ballots in Florida made people start to question the way that our elections were run, the type of equipment that we were using. And so a commission was formed, a bipartisan commission was formed to try and look at our elections closely and see where there were areas that needed to be improved. So starting in 2000, we started updating our voting equipment, outlawing old lever machines that we knew malfunctioned, getting rid of the butterfly ballots that caused the problems in Florida and things like that. But we also saw the introduction of more election reforms to try and make voting more accessible to voters. So we saw more states adopt no excuse absentee ballots. And that term can be confusing. So no excuse absentee ballot and vote by mail are new, but not perfectly synonymous. So a no excuse absentee ballot means you don't have to provide your state a reason that you want to vote by mail. In some states, still today in the United States, you have to provide an affidavit to the state stating why you can't vote in person. Some people view this as intrusive by the state because you might have to disclose medical reasons, you might have to disclose reasons, a death of a family member, or that maybe you're a caretaker for a family member, that in sort of the American individualism landscape is seen as is more information than the state really needs, right? You should be able to request a ballot from the state saying, I can't make it on election day, I want to exercise my right to vote. And so why do I have to provide you all of this very personal information? But some states really feel that you need to justify why you can't be there, do your civic duty and vote on election day. We also still have 5 states that don't allow vote by mail. And so some people say that in a time where, all of our time is pretty constrained and it's difficult to get to the polling place sometimes on election day. We vote on a weekday in the United States, we vote on Tuesdays. And so people are working, especially if you're an hourly worker, maybe you have small children, maybe you're working and in school. It can be difficult to get to the polls during those working hours. So absentee ballots or vote by mail is seen as a way to expand the franchise and invite more people into the system and to be able to vote at a time that's convenient for them and that works for them in their schedule. And there are some states that still don't allow that. And so that's one place where we've seen a push in say, this is a voting rights expansion, right? This is a way to increase the opportunities for more people to participate by offering absentee voting or vote by mail, as most places call it today. But we saw a move away from requiring a reason to do that and towards just allowing people that option without having to provide some justification for it. We've also seen a move towards what we call early in-person voting, which is the fact that vote centers are not just open, or precincts. Some places still call them precincts, some call them vote centers. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want, but the western part of the United States, which is very expansive and things are very far apart from each other, has really led the way on creating what are called vote centers. And a vote center is a place where you can vote at any location within your county. So as long as you're registered to vote in that county, you can go to any location you want. You're not assigned geographically to one in your neighborhood. Whereas a precinct model of voting is based on the idea that you live at 123 Main Street and you have to go to the precinct at the school down the block from you where the 600 of your closest neighbors also vote, right? And you're not allowed to go to a different location in your city. You have to go to that one because that's where they have your ballots with all the people for your district, right? Your school board member, your city councilor. A vote center model uses what's called a ballot on demand system, where you can give them your information, they can pull up your address, and they can print the ballot in real time that matches your jurisdiction. So the West, because it is so large and we travel further distances than the East, has been really at the forefront of adopting vote centers and moving towards that model and away from the precinct model that's still pretty popular in the Eastern United States. So we even see like regional differences in how people vote in the US, which is kind of interesting to think about. But we saw a big push towards early voting, allow more, the motto is sort of more days and more ways, right? So you can vote early in person, you can vote absentee, you have a longer election period, and these have become really popular reforms. And the narrative behind them is almost always a voting rights narrative. It's almost always about expanding access to voting and including more people, providing more opportunity, reducing barriers, reducing costs, right? Not monetary costs, but the cost of time. And so these are all sort of things we think about as voting rights. So when I'm asked to talk about, if I go too fast, let me know. When I'm asked to talk about voting rights, thanks. When I'm asked to talk about voting rights in the United States today, I think sometimes the idea of blatant, obvious voter suppression is what people have in mind, right? If we think of in the US, old Jim Crow era laws where people had to take litter tests or pay poll taxes, or people simply couldn't vote because they were a particular race or ethnic group or gender, right? Those types of voting rights fights are by and large have fallen by the wayside. The types of voting rights cases we see today tend to be a little bit more discrete, right? So do we see states limiting the number of locations in a particular jurisdiction? And if that jurisdiction happens to have a high racial or ethnic minority population, was that a motivating factor for reducing the number of voting locations? Or in some places, famously in like Cincinnati, Ohio, for example, you would have polling locations in neighborhoods that were densely populated with a large Black population, and they would have fewer poll workers working, or they would have fewer machines to process ballots. And then that would result in longer lines and longer wait times. And the allegations behind that is that if people have to wait much longer time, then they'll leave line and they simply won't vote, right? They'll have to go home and cook dinner and pick up their kids and things like that. And so they simply won't vote. So you're either making voting less convenient for people, or you are potentially intentionally trying to turn people away from the polls by making it difficult and time consuming to vote. And so that's one of the places where we see voting rights challenged. Voter ID is another place where we've seen voting rights challenged in the US in the last decade or so, requiring, some people say everybody has ID, but we have some evidence that that's not true, that people who live in densely populated urban areas that don't drive might not have ID. Elderly people who drive anymore are less likely to have ID. Minority voters, especially low-income minority voters, are less likely to have ID. For those who don't know, in the United States, the government doesn't provide your photo ID. You have to pay for it. So when you go to get your driver's license, it can cost anywhere from about $18 to $35 to get your driver's license. There have been states, and this has been federally, it's gone through federal courts and found to be true. There were states that enacted photo ID requirements and then reduced the number of DMV locations, or Department of Motor Vehicle locations, where you could get a driver's license. And this was in Alabama. And they reduced them coincidentally in counties that had high minority populations. And so that was found to be an act that was aimed at reducing access to a photo ID, coincided with requiring that as to vote, right? And so that is the type of restrictions on voter access and the voter suppression that we are seeing today. So it's not as blatant as it used to be. I just want to talk a little bit about 2020 and some of the election reforms that came out of 2020 as we head into 2022, some of the things that people are thinking about, and quite frankly, some election officials are concerned about heading into 2022 and even into 2024. So in 2020, obviously, we had, for the first time really in US history, recent US history anyway, sort of post-Civil War Reconstruction era US history, there were real threats to election workers. We had poll workers across the country that received threats from voters that if elections didn't turn out the way they wanted, that they were going to, there was intimidation, that they threatened violence against some poll workers. There were places where this was more concentrated, Arizona, Michigan. Both of those states had to put poll workers in secure areas during especially recounts and audits. They had to have sheriffs guarding them. The governor of Michigan had a kidnapping threat against her. The Secretary of State of Arizona had death threats against her. The Secretary of State of New Mexico had death threats against her. So there were several election officials in the US that received threats, and poll workers too. And poll workers in the United States, which I do want to talk about, poll workers in the United States are largely what you could call a volunteer army of workers. For the most part, people volunteer to be poll workers. They do get paid a small stipend in most places, maybe $100 for the day, which is a very, very long day. It's from 6 a.m. to usually 8 p.m. at the earliest, but often to midnight. And historically, poll workers were seen as people who just wanted to do their civic duty. They wanted to give back to their community. They wanted to be involved in the election process. Lots of times it was retirees. Our average age of a poll worker in the United States is about 67. And so when you had to recruit poll workers for one day of one long day of volunteer work, it was a little bit easier to get people. It has, with the creation of early voting, with expanding our election period to a couple of weeks, it's become more difficult because older folks say that they can't, it's too energy consuming. They can't work that many days in a row for that long. People who maybe are stay-at-home moms or retired or unemployed often say that it's too difficult to juggle their schedule around for that many days. So there were already challenges to recruiting poll workers in the US, and that's become even worse after 2020 because now people are worried about intimidation. They're worried that there's going to be threats to them if they try to show up and do their job and allow people to vote who have the right to vote. That some poll watchers, which is a totally separate group of people that we can talk about, they're worried that some poll watchers will try and intimidate them or harass them. And so people are not signing up to be poll workers. And election clerks have to recruit anywhere from 500 to thousands of people to run the elections on election day. And it's become very, very difficult for that to happen. So that is a big challenge this election season, is just not enough people to actually run the polls. And so election clerks, local election officials, are still really scurrying to get people to work. And that's a big effect of 2020 that we should be concerned about. I do want to talk about poll watchers. I just mentioned them. So for those of you who maybe don't know, in the United States, the political parties are allowed to put a designated watcher in an election site. So in your precinct or in your vote center, there can be a Republican and a Democrat. Third parties don't really engage in it, but potentially there could be a Green Party or Libertarian or something too. Those people traditionally have been allowed to stand directly behind the person who is checking in voters and to confirm that, yes, their ID was checked correctly, or they stated their name and birth date and address correctly, or things like that. If a party member feels that the voter checking in is not the person who's on the voter registration list, or that their ID didn't look like them, they have the authority to challenge that voter. So they can tell the poll worker that they challenge that person, that they want more confirmation that that voter is actually the voter as they're presenting themselves. This has become a voting rights issue for the trans community and the LGBT community, because some people have issued driver's license and their photograph on it, because in some states licenses are 4 years, some states 5 years, some states 10 years. So their photograph may be male presenting or female presenting, but they now, when they show up to vote, are different gender. And so people have been denied access to the right to vote for that. 40% of trans people say that they've had difficulty getting access to the ballot because of issues like this, where they're being denied based on their demographic profile not matching the way that they present at the polls. So that's another sort of voting rights issue that doesn't really get talked about a lot, and there's not a lot of coverage. But it's a thing that comes up, and it's one of the challenges of voter ID, right? Is that, and I think somebody maybe has a question about that, but voter ID, it's a difficult balancing act between securing the election and making sure the people who have the right to vote are the people who are casting the ballots, versus, taking away somebody's right based on a technicality that a driver's license is expired, or that maybe it doesn't have the correct address, or maybe they no longer present as that gender, and so their identity is questioned, right? And so those are challenges that we have, what are called street level bureaucrats. Often it's not the high election officials that are making these decisions, it's these poll workers and these poll watchers that are making the decisions. And that can seem inequitable and unfair to voters. And so that's another place where voting rights is murky, right? And how we protect rights. I know I'm almost out of time. I have a lot more things I'm willing to talk about. I don't know if you want me to stop and start taking questions. I think.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. Let's go ahead and thank you again for your very informative presentation. Appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. Let's go ahead and open the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your virtual hand and wait for me to call on you. When called on, please enable both your audio and your video and identify yourself with your full name and your media outlet. Please go ahead. I already have Pearl Matibe as the first taker. Pearl, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, Lisa. It's been very interesting listening to you, Power FM South Africa. So my question I just wanted to find out is, generally when the US is seeing other countries, given the fact that we're foreign correspondents, having elections, they tend to have their own observers and this kind of framework of how to assess whether that process is free, fair, or credible. So in view of these domestic elections, is there an independent body or a combined coalition of people who themselves are possibly looking at that assessment, that election management process, that full set of rules to make sure these things are happening the way that they should? And who is doing the voter education? Is the voter education incumbent on each state, or how is that seen so that voter education is standardized or equal all across the country?
Okay, great questions. Okay, so I will, first is about observation of elections. So the United States does invite foreign election observers to come and watch US elections. Just as we go to other countries, we do have people come here and watch them. Generally speaking, they usually observe in large metropolitan areas, so places like New York, DC, Los Angeles. Interestingly, those places tend to be, for the most part, very good on election administration and following policies. They often don't go to very rural areas, like, say, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, right, where you have what we would call unprofessional election administrators or non-professional election administrators. And that's not a judgment on how, when I say unprofessional, I mean, there's not necessarily any official training or certification required to be the election official in these small jurisdictions. And so the rate of professionalization of the people is very small, and that's where you're more likely to see errors or misapplication of the rules and policies. And often election observers don't get to those areas. So there is some observation, but I would say that maybe not always in the right places. Domestically, the Carter Center has a very long history of foreign election observations and foreign election research, again, going to Africa and South America and Asia to study elections and how elections are run. And after the 2016 election, they had never done work in the United States, even though they're a US-based organization, but they started an American elections project. And so now they are actually observing elections in the United States. They're starting with 3 states this year: Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, because all 3 of those states had big challenges in 2020. Not only mishandling of ballots, I mean, accusations of mishandling of ballots, right? All of the audits showed that things were processed correctly. All of the lawsuits essentially were rejected and thrown out. But they got a lot of media attention as there being issues in all 3 of those states. And you may recall, right, Arizona had the full audit, Michigan had several audits, and Pennsylvania had absentee ballots backed up for days. And so, and then they had audits after that. And so that's where they're starting their 3 observations. So that's sort of the current state of who's watching elections officially in the US. Your second question was, I'm sorry, can you repeat your second question?
Absolutely. My second question was on voter education and to
yes.
what extent the equitability across the United States that, the general public is receiving voter education.
Yes.
And
okay.
Is there a coalition of people doing it? Is it institutionalized? Is it from state? Because that is one of the very core elements. If we're taking a look at the basic set of things that need to be in place for an election then to be considered free, fair, or credible, voter education is a really key tenet. So I'm really interested to find out about that. Thanks.
Yes. Okay, so that's actually a great question. So the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which was passed in response to 2000, which talked about how to update our election administration and election infrastructure, required states to come up with a voter education plan in order to be eligible to receive federal funds to update their elections equipment and election systems. States submitted plans, but many states never implemented those plans. And so the federal government, when I said they don't have a lot of authority to enforce, right, they could require that states submit them, but there wasn't an enforcement mechanism to make sure that states were actually implementing those plans. So there is a lot of variance across states by who is actually conducting voter education and what constitutes voter education and to what extent it's being carried out. So almost all states have a chief election official, which in many states is a secretary of state, but in some states is a lieutenant governor. That there are a few states that still do not have that office. That office is supposed to make public all of the rules about election code in that state, what the election policies are, but they're also supposed to educate voters about how to register, when to register, where they can vote. As far as voting locations and things like that goes, it goes down to the county level. So counties also are responsible for voter education. In some states, it's very strict. So here where I live, for example, my election official has to reach out to me with at least 2 direct mailings, letting me know that there's an election coming up, letting me know where I can vote, that I can vote absentee if I'd like, I could vote in the in-person if I'd like, right? Lay out sort of all the rules. We also in California have a voter education guide, a voter information guide, where it tells you all of the candidates that are going to be on the ballot, the different ballot propositions, and it provides pros and cons about the different propositions based on, you know, different groups that have submitted statements on the ballot initiatives or the constitutional amendments. Many states don't do that, and so it is very, again, like voter experiences, the amount of educational information you receive from the state or your local election official varies widely by the jurisdiction that you live in. There isn't really a uniform voter education plan across the United States. And so in a lot of places, third-party groups, nonpartisan groups or partisan groups fill in that gap. They fill in that role. So in the US, I think one of the groups that does a lot of voter education and that a lot of people look to as a credible and reputable organization to do this is the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is largely seen as influential in most states. They do a lot of work on policy, but they do a lot of work on voter education and voter registration. Other third-party organizations step in to do this as well. And then to some degree, the political parties. The political parties are really more about voter mobilization and getting people out to vote, but part of that is education. So there has been some sort of renewed interest in who are the reputable, nonpartisan organizations that we should be able to look to for good information about elections. But I think, again, it's because things are so decentralized and the experience and the rules are so different across every jurisdiction, it becomes really hard for any one organization to step in and do all of that work nationwide. So I don't know if that was a helpful answer, but.
No, thank you. That was enlightening for us. And thank you, Pearl, for that question. I'll turn to Sulaiman Daoud. Please go ahead and unmute yourself, sir, and please announce your full name and your media organization as well.
Hello, Dr. Brian. Thank you for giving us this briefing. My name is Sulaiman from Singapore, Mothership SG. I have actually 2 questions if you have the time. The first is, they're actually connected. So we know that there is a very significant case being heard by the Supreme Court, Moore versus Harper. I'm not entirely sure the implications of that decision, but I've read a few articles that seem to hint that this case may give state legislatures the power to decide how elections go within the particular state. And I also have read that the US Senate they may reach a deal over the Electoral Count Act reform, whereby it will close certain loopholes of the sort that kind of inspired the January 6th Capitol storming. So my question is, how worried are you actually, that the Supreme Court case may affect democracy in America as we know it? And could the Electoral Count Act reform actually help to kind of mitigate whatever the Supreme Court decides? Thank you so much.
I think the 2 of them are sort of inherently related. So with Moore versus Harper, the state legislature case, I'm actually fairly concerned about that case, I will say. I think that most states, so the idea is that when a state electoral count is certified, so we count the ballots, The counties submit this to the chief election official, the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State, there's a certification process where any outstanding ballots have to be remedied, ballots that are out for cured have to be counted, things like that, which I don't know if anybody, we could talk about curing ballots too, but, and then audits have to be conducted. And then after all of those things have happened, the state certifies the election and they report the results to, this is only to the degree that this is matters, is we're talking about presidential electors, right? So, and then they present those to the state legislature. The state legislature is actually in charge of calling the electors together and then recording the vote of the electors. And those are then sent to Congress to, you know, in a diplomatic packet or whatever. And then that's how they count the electoral college. So electors meet in states and then they send the results of that, the state legislature to the Congress. If a state legislature had the authority to not accept the certified results from the chief election official and to determine that they did not believe that to be the true winner of the state and send the electors that they believe that they determined, not as election officials, not as the people who have counted the ballots, that would be, I would say, a grave threat to our democratic processes in the United States. I think that I think most states would reject that idea. I think most states would say this is not how we run things in the United States, and that's not the process that we're going to follow. But there would be some states that I think would be happy to run with that power. And again, I don't know how much people know about how state legislatures work in the United States, but state legislatures are also not inherently professional. And so some states, California has a professional legislature where it's a full-time job and the people are paid a salary, an actual salary that they can live on, and that they are expected to be full-time legislators. In some states, it is New Mexico, for example, the state legislature is paid a per diem to go to Santa Fe, and it's pretty low. It's less than $100 a day, and they meet for only 30 days a year, and in even years, and in odd years, they meet for 60 days a year because those are called budget years. And so, and then in Texas, you know, they only meet every other year. And so there's wide variation in the qualifications of state legislators, in the backgrounds, the education levels, the professionalization. And in many places, the people in the state legislatures just really aren't qualified to be making those decisions. So I think it's actually a pretty scary potential decision coming down from the Supreme Court. And that is, I shared a lot of personal opinion, but in terms of the Electoral Count Reform Act, that's trying to say that, you know, that your electors have to vote the way that your state has voted, and it's trying to get rid of the faithless elector problems. We don't really have faithless elector problems, but the idea that faithless elector problems exist, right? So that's a big thing there.
Thank you so much for that. I'll turn to Maral Nashad Sharifi. Maral, if you could please unmute yourself and state your full organization name. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, so I cover the US news for Volkskrant, which is a Dutch national newspaper. Thank you so much for talking to us. It's all very interesting. So a lot of the Republican candidates that are going to run for Congress, our supporters believe in a big lie. I think it's even more than, I think it's even a majority of people. And I'm very interested in how are election officials taking any kind of preparations in order to deal with possible allegations of fraud on election day? Like, how are they preparing for that? Do you know?
Okay. Yeah, so they are trying to make set up things to have very transparent processes. So one of the big changes that we've seen since 2022 is the recording of more processes so that things are There's digital records of everything that happens. So for example, I mentioned ballot curing earlier. When you send in a vote by mail ballot in the United States, many states do a signature match on your envelope. They scan the signature, or in some places they have people visually look at it. They compare it to your signature on your voter registration form or your driver's license record, because most states have your election information. Your registration can pull and connect to your driver's license information, so it can pull your signature off of your latest driver's license and match that. Say that your signatures don't match. Well, that ballot gets essentially rejected. You, as of get notified, your ballot has been received, but your signatures don't match. You have the opportunity, 10 days or whatever, to come in and cure your ballot, to remedy it, to make it right. So it means you have to go in and you have to update your signature. You have to provide photo ID and evidence that you are the person who sent it, update your signature, and affirm that that actually was your signature, right? That process has become more transparent. So they're scanning the signatures, they're showing the ballots that are getting rejected. In some places, they are using webcasting to show the counting process to go on. They're inviting more people to come and watch the process. Audits are now being streamed live in a lot of places, and they're going to be streamed so that people can, sit at home and watch the audit process and the counting process. So I think that's one way that election officials are trying to combat the big lie, is by saying our processes and our chain of custody, we follow the same process all the time. You're welcome to observe them. You're welcome to come and be part of the process. One risk of that, of course, is that some places have seen supporters of the big lie trying to fill positions, and there really are no important positions like sitting on absentee control boards. So the absentee boards are the ones who confirm all the absentee ballots, or sitting on acting as poll workers, and with the idea that they might try to or attempt to reject voters that they don't think are legitimate voters, or they don't think they're actually registered, or their driver's license is expired, or something like that. And so election officials are actually concerned because our election codes are ill-equipped to be able to reject people from doing that public service. So there are not a lot of ways. So election officials in several places have mentioned to me that they know there are people who support the big lie and believe in the big lie, who are signing up to be poll workers or to be precinct judges and precinct captains, and there's nothing in the books that allows them to deny that person the right to serve. And even if that person if the person harasses voters, they could have them removed by the sheriff's department, but there's nothing preventing them from signing up for the next election, right? And so our election codes are not equipped to deal with sort of the influx of, for lack of a better term, conspiracy theorists who are trying to essentially to become more of the part of the process and sort of infiltrate working in the election system. And that's happening even at some of the county levels. You have people who support the big lie running to be county clerks and to be election officials themselves. And so
And they can change those codes.
They can change them, yes. So the state legislatures can change the election codes. But a lot of them have not done that yet in response to 2020. And so.
No, stop it.
Me?
I think somebody's hot mic is on. If you can turn it off, whoever's is on.
I think it was Jonathan. I was like, I know, Jonathan, we should stop it now. Okay.
John, turn your hot mic off kindly. I'll turn to Tiago Amancio. Tiago, please unmute yourself, show your video as well, and please state your full name and your media outlet. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Tiago Amancio from the Brazilian newspaper Folha de São Paulo. So, as you said, we have many election deniers running this year for important offices that deal with election rules, such as Secretary of State, for example. If these people are elected, do you think this could impact the 2024 election?
Well, I'm going to give you my optimistic point of view. So my optimistic view is that once people get in office and they actually see how elections are run, because people can run for these offices and have no experience being an election worker or being a poll worker, and then once they get into office, they'll see that there is a very clear set of guidelines that they have to follow in order to run the election. And so the optimistic side of me that believes in policy and believes in good bureaucracy thinks that they will come to realize that they bought into a myth that was based on misinformation and disinformation and just simply being uninformed. The more pessimistic side of me would say that they could potentially feel empowered to try and sway the election, or to try and not enforce some policies. I don't know that it would be widespread enough to influence the 2024 election. I think that we'll have to see how many people actually end up filling positions where they're running elections. But it is something I know that election officials and people who study election administration, it is very much on the radar and people are paying attention to. I just don't, I don't necessarily want to speculate yet. I'll just say that I believe in the processes, and I believe that at the end of the day, that the election code is actually a good thing. That it directs election officials in how to conduct elections and how to run a fair and free election. And as long as people follow the code, right, which is the tricky part, as long as people follow the code, I think that it will be okay.
Thank you so much for that. I will go ahead and ask a question that was submitted in our chat by Mien Nguyen from Tan Nguyen agency in Vietnam. So the question is, I can see US media notice many states' efforts to control access to the ballot, for example. Some Republican-controlled states that have enacted more restrictive voting laws since the 2020 election, many of them aimed at suppressing Democratic turnout and vice versa. What roles will the US press play to help make the best use of their right to vote in this case?
Thanks, Mian. I didn't get to that part of my talk because I ran out of time. But yes, you're right. States like Georgia and Texas in particular have made it more restricted in terms of what you have to include on your ballot. So now including your driver's license number, your social security, last 4 digits of social security, your date of birth. And if people forget any one piece of that information, then their ballot can be rejected. So to be clear, that's if you vote by mail, and that's on the outside of your ballot envelope, not on your actual ballot itself. You don't have to identify yourself on your actual ballot where you cast your votes, but on the outside envelope. What the media can do, I think, and the media does a little bit of this when they're covering the policy changes, but I think what they can do is in stories leading up to elections, simply reminding people that including all your pieces of information on your vote by mail ballot, the deadlines for requesting a vote by mail ballot have changed. So for example, Georgia narrowed the window to be able to not only request a ballot, but then also to be able to return that ballot. They cut it in half. And so reminding people about when the ballots need to be returned, when they need to be requested, what voter registration deadlines are. We didn't really even get into that, but voter registration deadlines vary from state to state. They are, again, another thing in the United States that is not consistent across states. So states like New York, you have to register 4 or 5 days before the election. States like Minnesota register on election day. So, so reporters, if they are doing, especially local reporters, right? If they are doing any coverage on elections, just simply even having like a box in an article that has a reminder about here's the registration deadline. Make sure you do these things on your ballot. I think the big story is of calling out these changes and saying, is this really an election security measure, or is this a way to potentially reduce the number of people who are voting? I think those are important stories. But in terms of thinking about it from like a voter education perspective, like I think maybe it was Pearl that asked the question, I think the media can play a role in voter education by simply repeating those policies anytime they do a story about elections, right? It could be about It could be about somebody running for office, and then just a simple, as a reminder, the deadline to register to vote is blah, 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 and return your ballot by, the deadline in that state. And I know that there's always a crunch for the number of words you can have in a column, but it could be a very useful voter education tool that they could embrace.
Thank you for that. There is a pre-submitted question from Olivier O'Mahony from Paris Match, France. He asks, I would love to have a clarification about the notion of alternative slate of electors during the presidential 2020 election that was brought up by election deniers.
Right. So this was supposedly part of the big Trump plan was that, so in the United States, for people who don't know, prior to the election, a party has to provide a slate of electors to the chief election officials, mostly the Secretary of State. So this would be, for example, in my state, right, the 55 people who are going to cast the votes on behalf of the state. They can't be heads of the party. They can't be elected officials. Usually they are what we would call party insiders, people who run the political party organizations at the county level. And it's sort of your reward for being a loyal party member that you get to be an elector. And so sometimes they're big donors, right? And so you turn those names into the Secretary of State ahead of the election. There's a certification process that the Secretary of State certifies that you are eligible to be an elector. And you can only be an elector for one party, right? So depending on who wins in your state. And the fake electors, or the alternate slate of electors, is this idea that the Trump supporters would supply certifications that were false certifications for people who could then show up to be electors, and then they could vote not necessarily the way the state voted, but then they could vote for Trump, and that this could potentially change the outcome of the election and make sure that Trump was the one who was quote unquote faithfully reelected, right? Because the false electors would be falsely certifying him as the victor instead of who actually won the state. Usually an alternate slate of electors does not have sort of nefarious purposes. It is really just simply a safeguard that if an elector cannot serve due to, weather or health or something like that, that an alternate could go in their place. It wouldn't be somebody who was going to go in and be a faithless elector. Is a person who, say that the state of California goes to the Democrat, right? That they will show up and say, cast their vote for the Republican, even though the state went for the Democrat. Because it is a roll call vote, and each person as an elector gets to verbally cast their vote. And so there have been instances of people being a faithless elector and not casting their vote the way the state went. Some states have policies that then allow that person to be fined, or there to be some sort of charges brought against that person for not faithfully executing their duty as they certified they would. But some states, there are really no repercussions. That said, it happens very, very rarely. And so, so the idea that in 7 states that Trump supporters could propose this alternate slate of electors and then potentially flip those states by serving and then voting for Trump, even if he didn't win those states, it's a crafty scheme, but I don't necessarily think that it would work. So.
That's very helpful to know. I'm going to go ahead and ask one last question submitted by Yelena Stevanovic from Politica Serbia. Why is it so in America that many people talk about voter suppression just because one is required to register, have an ID, or prove that he or she is an American citizen in order to vote? All those things are a regular procedure in developed democracies such as the UK and France, yet no one questions whether the UK and France are real democracies.
Okay, I think the answer is twofold. I think one is where the history of voter registration came from in the United States. So we didn't always have voter registration in the United States. It's a progressive era change, which means it happened around the early 1900s, and it was born out of party machine politics. There are still, North Dakota, for example, in the US still does not require voter registration. It's not required by law. So I think the idea that you, as a US citizen, right, and the Constitution affords you the right to vote, and it doesn't afford you the right to vote as long as you have a driver's license or an ID. It just says that you have a right to vote as a US citizen who's over the age of 18. And so I think the idea that voter registration rolls, first of all, when you register, you affirm your US citizenship, you affirm to the government that you are not lying, and you provide evidence of your either a driver's license or a birth certificate, or you put in your driver's license number and you attach it to an agency that has already confirmed your identity. And so if you've already done that with the state, why do you have to continue to do it each election cycle? Why do you have to show your ID every time you show up to vote, right? You've already confirmed your identity with the state once. You have to remember, Americans are very individualistic, and this idea of low government intrusion or low government oversight resonates with a lot of Americans. So there's that. The bigger issue, I think, is actually about the inequitable applications of the law. So in some states, you have to show voter ID, and in some states, you don't. In some states, the voter ID can be, is pretty wide variety of things that you can show. You can show, if you're a college student, you can show a college ID. You could show, your Costco membership card has a photograph and your name on it. Some states accept that. Some states will accept pretty much anything that has your photograph and your name. Other states, your driver's license could be expired, right? So maybe you're an older person who no longer drives, and so but you still carry around your expired driver's license for identification purposes. Some states will allow that. Other states are very strict. It has to be a state-issued driver's license or ID, or a military ID, and it is not allowed to be expired. And then there is what we would call sort of partisan motivations in choosing which IDs count. So for example, in Texas, you might be able to use a hunting license, but you can't use your college ID. Well, hunters tend to lean more conservative, not exclusively, but they tend to lean more conservative. And so you're allowing a little bit more flexibility for potentially conservative voters, whereas college students tend to lean a little bit more liberal and might be more likely to vote Democrat. And you're not allowing or affording that same opportunity for them to use a non-state issued ID. And so even if they go to a state school, right? Even if they go to University of Texas, that's not an acceptable form of ID. So it's not necessarily always that people get very bothered about the fact that ID is required. It's about the fact that it is inequitably applied to people across the United States. And like I said, it varies from state to state, right? And there's no real evidence that voter ID reduces voter fraud, because there's not a lot of evidence of any widespread voter fraud to begin with. It's very rare, and we hear about cases here and there because people like to talk about anomalies, but it's very rare for people to show up to vote and, for me to go and present myself as my sister or something, right? I could do it, but it doesn't happen that often. And so sometimes these laws are seen as, a little bit restrictive without a real purpose or cause behind them. I think those are the reasons.
Well, thank you so much for enlightening us all. We are now out of time. On behalf of the U.S. Department of State, I would like to thank Dr. Bryant for being with us today. Today's briefing was on the record. I will share a transcript with everyone who's participating today, and it will be posted on our website, fpc.state.gov. Thank you all and have a wonderful day. And thank you so much for your time, Dr. Bryant.
Thank you.